The house on Briarwood Lane had been empty for decades. It stood like a grim sentinel against time, its windows dark and lifeless, its exterior covered in a tangle of ivy that seemed almost sentient in its slow encroachment over the decaying wood. Nobody went near it, not since the night the Miller family vanished without a trace. The only sound that ever echoed from its empty halls was the rustling of wind through broken panes and something else, a faint murmur, a whisper. When Ethan moved to Briarwood Lane, he thought the stories were just that, stories. He'd come to escape his own ghosts, a failed marriage, a job that had sapped his spirit, and a gnawing emptiness that threatened to swallow him whole. The solitude of the old neighborhood seemed like a sanctuary. The house called to him. It was the very reason the rent was so cheap. The landlord had almost begged him to take it, and Ethan, feeling reckless and tired of living in the shadow of his own failures, had agreed. From the moment he stepped inside, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. Dust motes swirled lazily in the weak afternoon sunlight that filtered through cracked curtains. The floorboards groaned under his weight, as if protesting his presence. But Ethan brushed off the unease. This was his chance for a fresh start, to finally write that novel he'd always talked about, but never began. It started with small things, missing items, doors that were open in the morning when he was certain he'd closed them the night before, and that ever-present feeling of being watched. But he dismissed these occurrences as symptoms of an overactive imagination. He was alone in an old house. Old houses creaked and groaned. It was nothing, but then he started hearing the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible over the hum of his laptop and the soft rustling of leaves outside. Ethan would pause, listening intently, but the sound would vanish as soon as he focused on it. He started wearing headphones to drown out the noises, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. One night, while staring blankly at the blank page of his manuscript, he heard it clearly, a voice, soft and pleading.
Help me!
Ethan froze. The whisper was coming from behind the wall in front of him. He slowly pulled off his headphones, heart pounding so hard he thought it would burst. "Who's there?" he called out, feeling foolish as soon as the words left his mouth. Silence. But then, after a few seconds, the whisper returned, more distinct this time.
Help us!
Ethan's breath hitched. "Us." He stood up, knocking his chair over in his haste. The voice was clearer now, but muffled, as if it was coming from within the wall itself. He pressed his ear to the cool plaster, straining to hear.
We're trapped, can't get out!
The words chilled him to the bone. He stumbled back, his mind racing. Who was trapped? There shouldn't be anyone else in the house. Was it a recording? A prank? He'd heard of landlords doing strange things to tenants, but this beyond bizarre. Desperation clawed at his throat. He grabbed a hammer from his toolbox and, with trembling hands, began to chip away at the wall. The plaster crumbled easily, revealing rotted wood underneath. He worked feverishly, not stopping even when his hands began to bleed from splinters and rough edges. Finally, he broke through. Behind the wall was a narrow crawl space. The air that wafted out was rank, filled with the stench of decay. Ethan gagged, stepping back. But he had to know, had to see. He shone his flashlight into the darkness and nearly dropped it in shock. There, huddled in the shadows, were three figures. They were grotesque, barely human twisted forms, with hollow eyes and mouths frozen in eternal scream. But they moved, ever so slightly, as if straining against some invisible force. One of them, a woman with matted hair and skin stretched tight over her bones, turned her head slowly toward him. Her eyes, milky and dead, locked onto his.
Help us!
Ethan staggered back, his mind reeling. They couldn't be real. They couldn't. His thoughts were shattered as he heard a loud crack behind him. He spun around, just in time to see the wall he'd broken begin to seal itself up, the plaster and wood knitting together as if time were rewinding. Panic surged through him. He tried to escape, but his feet felt like they were mired in quicksand. The room seemed to warp and twist, the very walls closing in around him. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, filling his ears with 1,000 voices, all begging, pleading, screaming.
We're trapped. Join us.
Ethan's scream echoed through the house, but outside, there was no one to hear it. The house on Briarwood Lane stood silent and still, its windows dark and lifeless. The whispers faded back into the walls, merging with the house itself. Another resident, another soul, forever claimed, and the house waited, patient as ever, for its next victim.